Okay, welcome to part two. So, their next single was I Feel Fine, and it once again proved that the Beatles could continue to sound fresh after multiple singles and albums, which is something that so many artists struggle with. I Feel Fine continues to stay true to what made the Beatles great in the first place, but the guitar riff that drives the song, as well as the feedback that opens it, gives this song a unique feel to it. And it's interesting, this song was probably the earliest song to include feedback, so it's clear that even in these early years, the Beatles were keen to try new things. Now, Beatles for Sale is often considered their weakest album behind Yellow Submarine, and I think there are two reasons for this. Firstly, this album contains 6 covers, which sort of makes it feel a bit of a step back from A Hard Day's Night, and that's reasonable. I mean, even if the I Feel Fine single had been included on this album, they still would have needed 4 covers to fill it. The other reason is that it doesn't contain any songs that are as classic as A Hard Day's Night and Can't Buy Me Love, which is also reasonable, but these original songs, while they may not be as classic as some of the songs on A Hard Day's Night, they display a growing maturity that would blossom over the next year. And these original songs continued to show their versatility as songwriters and musicians. Already we start to see the Beatles becoming more than just a pop group. In fact, they had already come a pretty long way since the days of From Me to You and She Loves You, and people always underrate that growth because it's so small compared with the growth that they displayed on their late albums like Rubber Soul, Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's. But songs like No Reply, I'm a Loser and I Don't Want to Spoil the Party were clear indications of the direction that they were headed as artists. Also, the originals were really consistent in quality, and I'd much rather that they do a few great covers rather than record throwaway tracks like Little Child and Don't Bother Me. And like A Hard Day's Night, the weakest original songs on this album are made up for with diversity. Like What You're Doing, it's not a particularly great songwriting effort, but the arrangement had a very distinct feel to it that was really quite great. So the highlight of this album was actually 8 Days a Week, and it may not have signified their growth as much as the other songs I mentioned. It's interesting because on the surface you think, oh, it's alright, it's got a decent melody, the lyrics are pretty simple, but it's got a nice feel to it. It's a good song, but it's not that great. But there are songs like this that don't attempt to be anything special. They're just, attempting to be just really good, decent songs. And they don't contain anything that you would expect to find in an outstanding song. But they're just made so perfectly and so flawlessly that you just can't help but love them. I would say that this song is perfect in the most minimal way. The Beatles did nothing more than master the basics, and they did everything so effortlessly. John Lennon once said in an interview that this song is lousy, and maybe to an extent he was right. It certainly doesn't seem like the Beatles tried too hard with this song, but that's the thing, at this point in their career, they didn't have to try too hard to make great music. The covers all contain great performances from the Beatles, but these songs were not particularly important to the Beatles' development as artists, so they're pretty much filler. I mean, they're good songs, but they're kind of acting as filler tracks. The only reason they did these covers was because they didn't have enough time to make any original songs for the album. Overall, this album is definitely weaker than A Hard Day's Night. Compared with their first two albums, however, I would say that all those three albums, Please With Me, With the Beatles, and Beatles for Sale, they all have some great highlights, and they also have a bit of filler. I would say that Beatles for Sale is just slightly below their first two albums, but only by a very small amount. I think the biggest problem with this album is just the amount of material they were trying to release each year. Nowadays, people spend at least a year or two to make each album, and their singles would be taken from one of the albums. But the Beatles, they were attempting to release two albums and four standalone singles each year. That's 36 songs a year. Of course, the Beatles only managed to release I think they released 32 songs in 1963 and 33 songs in 1964, but still, that is more than double what you could expect any of today's artists to come up with. Anyone in that position would have struggled to come up with enough material, so it was inevitable that these albums would contain some covers and some filler tracks. But what the Beatles managed to achieve in just 2 years was just incredible. I mean, you look at Michael Jackson. I mean, he released some great music during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and that string of albums, starting with Off the Wall and ending with Dangerous, was brilliant. But those four albums were released over a period of 12 years. The Beatles, in just 7 years, released probably the equivalent of about 15 albums. 15 in 7 years, as opposed to 4 in 12 years. I mean, that is just ridiculous. Now, Help is where we really start to see the Beatles transitioning into that more experimental, more sophisticated stage of their career. Sure, we still get songs like Help, The Night Before, and Another Girl, which are still very associated with their early music, and we've even got two covers. But then we've got songs like You've Gotta Hide Your Love Away, It's Only Love, and I've Just Seen a Face. And I would say that these songs became the framework for their next album. So this album serves as a perfect bridge between their early pop albums to their later masterpieces. And it contains some of their best material to date. Although I would say that due to the combination of pop songs, covers, and more mature work, that this album is a little less focused than A Hard Day's Night. The best songs on this album are Ticket to Ride and Yesterday. On one hand, Ticket to Ride feels a little more consistent with their early hits like A Hard Day's Night and I Wanna Hold Your Hand than their late work, just in that they all have that similar kind of spirit when they're sung. But on the other hand, the Beatles gave this song a very unique tone to it that I think really displays their creative growth in the same way that a lot of their other songs on the album do, like You've Got to Hide Your Love Away and I've Just Seen a Face. And I mentioned with songs like A Hard Day's Night, I Should Have Known Better, and I Feel Fine and all that, that they all have something about them that makes them really stand out. But at the same time, they're all pretty consistent in that they're all very upbeat, light, joyful kind of songs. And while Ticket to Ride still has the same roots as these songs, it has a very heavy, darker tone to it. I also think that this song had John Lennon's best vocal performance to date, not to mention the brilliant harmonies between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, and the arrangement is just superb. Yesterday needs no introduction. It is simply an amazing ballad with a brilliant melody, timeless lyric, brilliant vocal from Paul McCartney, and a string quartet that gives this song that extra touch. But at the same time, you wonder why this particular song is so special, because there have been tons of acoustic ballads in history sung by amazing singers. So what is it that makes this song stand out among the rest? And why is this the most covered song in history? Well, firstly, the melody is so natural that you find it hard to believe that anyone wrote this song in the first place. In fact, that's exactly what Paul McCartney felt when he first wrote this song. The melody came to Paul in a dream, and when he woke up, he thought he had remembered some old jazz tune or something, and it took ages for Paul to finally be convinced that he actually wrote it. But when he did, he gave the song lyrics that are just as timeless and universal as the melody. And the theme of this song is so universal that so many people can relate to, and I think that's one of the key reasons why this song has been covered so much. Now, it's worth noting that George Harrison wrote two of the songs on this album. The Beatles had only previously recorded one of his songs, which was Don't Bother Me, and it was pretty lame. These songs, however, were both really good. Not the best songs in this album, but at the same time, they managed to blend in very well with parts like You've Gotta Hide Your Love Away and It's Only Love, and we really get to see George Harrison develop as a singer as well. Now, the only original song that I'm not particularly a fan of is Another Girl, because not only is it the weakest original song on the album, but the Beatles didn't really work that much to make it stand out from the rest, so I would say it's basically a filler track. Other than that, all the original songs are really excellent. Now, as for the covers, Act Naturally, I actually really like. I think it blends in very well with the other songs on this album, and I think when they did this cover, they didn't just do it because they didn't have enough original material. They did it because they felt it showed a different side to them that they wanted to show, and this was a great opportunity for Ringo to show that he was actually a pretty good singer. Dizzy Miss Lizzy, however, really doesn't belong on this album. In fact, it wasn't even recorded for this album, it was recorded specifically for the North American market where it was included on Beatles 6. But when they needed an extra song to fill the album, they were like, okay, well, there's those two songs we recorded for the American market, let's just dump one of them on it. Basically, whoever decided to include Dizzy Miss Lizzy on the album was still thinking of the album as simply an efficient way of getting a bunch of songs out there in one go, and this had been the case ever since the LP was first invented. But on this album, we start to see the Beatles plant the seeds for what the album was about to become. On Rubber Soul and Revolver, we get this thing where every song stands out from each other, yet there is something about these songs that not only unifies them, but also distinguishes them from any other song in their catalogue. And while this is not as much the case on Help as it was on those later albums, we do see this play out to a small extent as we listen to this album. That is until we hear Dizzy Miss Lizzy, and any thought of what I just described completely goes out the window. And this is why this album gets nowhere near the amount of praise as their later albums, even though just based on their songs. I don't think Rubber Soul was as much an improvement on Help as people acknowledge. Thankfully, however, Dizzy Miss Lizzy was their last cover, and it can be interpreted as a way of sending off that first stage of their career. I think Help served as a perfect way to transition from that teenage pop group stage to that more mature stage, and it provides the perfect send off to that first stage of their career, as well as giving fans a sneak peek at what was to come. This album had some of their best material. However, it's not as much of a well-rounded album as their later albums, and even A Hard Day's Night I think was slightly better in this regard. But overall, I think it was their best album to date. But it was no match for their later albums, except for Yellow Submarine and possibly Let It Be. Now, on Rubber Soul, everything that the Beatles were headed towards over the past year came to a climax. I will say first off that this was definitely not a turning point for the group. A turning point in this context is a point where their musical direction changes. A great example of a turning point is when the Rolling Stones realised, after the reception of their Satanic Majesty's request, that trying to go psychedelic was a mistake, and that their music needed to take a different direction. This is not like that. This is more like what happens during puberty when someone goes from being a child to an adult. That is not a turning point. It wasn't like you were going to be a kid all your life and then suddenly you decided you needed to become an adult. No, becoming an adult is a change in your life, but it's an inevitable change. And so change doesn't necessarily mean a turning point. It's only a turning point if you originally didn't plan for it to happen. If you think Rubber Soul was a turning point, I don't think you've really paid attention to the direction that their music was taking on Beatles for Sale and Help. But Rubber Soul was a big step forward for the band. It's where they got rid of all their covers, all those basic upbeat pop songs, and said, right, this is who we are now. We are not just a pop group anymore. But at the same time, the Beatles didn't completely reinvent themselves either. They retained the overall spirit of their early albums, and they didn't lose sight of the qualities that made them a great band in the first place. I find with all the great songs on this album that what ultimately makes them great is exactly the same as what makes songs like She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Ticket to Ride so great. Only now they have different ways of displaying these qualities. Unlike the youthful spirit of She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, these songs have a more mature feel to them. Also, the Beatles became more creative and inventive with these songs. I said of their early music that they were always trying to make each song sound different to any of their previous songs. But compared with the music they made from Rubber Soul onwards, their early music all sounds pretty much the same, even though by most standards their early music was quite diverse. Each song on this album had something about it that made it really unique. The best song on this album is In My Life. It has the same level of emotion as all the early classics, only now they display it with a more personal, sentimental approach. I find that with most of their songs that are similar to this were written and sung by Paul McCartney, and so we didn't get to see this kind of performance from John Lennon very often. But this is hands down one of his best performances with the Beatles, and the piano solo is very good. It gives this song that extra touch that is really, really excellent. Their next best song is Norwegian Wood, which is where we begin to see the Beatles experimenting with instruments that weren't previously associated with rock music. On this song, it was the sitar, which George Harrison had learnt to play during the filming of Help, and the story goes that he had the sitar just lying around in the studio, and when George felt that the song needed something extra, he just picked up the sitar and started playing. So there was no thought that really went into it. He was just following his instinct. And it doesn't seem that unusual now, but using foreign instruments like the sitar on a record was groundbreaking at the time. The other songs that I really love are Nowhere Man, I'm Looking Through You, and If I Needed Someone. Nowhere Man is notable for being the first Beatles song to contain no lyrics about love, while If I Needed Someone shows George Harrison really catching up with the standards set by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Other notable songs includes the opening track Drive My Car, which opens this album in the same upbeat fashion that I Saw Standing There, It Won't Be Long, A Hard Day's Night and Help did for their respective albums. But this song has a feel to it that's quite different from their previous songs, so immediately we get the sense that this is a different kind of record. Also, Girl may not be one of their best compositions, but it had yet another brilliant vocal from John Lennon. This album has a lot of great songs, but at the same time, so does Help. And if you take all the songs from Help and Rubber Soul and rank them together, I find that Rubber Soul is actually not that much of an improvement on Help as I think people think. So, why is this considered a masterpiece and not Help? The reason is that these songs are far more unified than the songs on Help. When the Beatles were making this album, they started to think of the album as not just a collection of singles that happened to appear on the same piece of vinyl, but as a project in itself, with each song being one component of a much bigger picture. And I think this has a lot to do with the way in which this album was made. Unlike their previous albums where they would record a few songs at a time between extensive amounts of touring, the Beatles were given the opportunity to spend 4 straight weeks in the studio focusing all their attention on making this album. And while it's not a concept album or anything like that, it just feels like these songs really belong together, despite the fact that they're also quite diverse. And I think that is the most groundbreaking thing about this album.